Blood dripped from the rusted chains binding her wrists to the damp stone wall. They called her a traitor, a murderer sentenced to rot in the abyss. But when the conquering Alpha King descended into the darkness, the beast roaring in his chest didn't demand her execution. It demanded its mate. The dungeon of Wormkeep was a place where hope went to be devoured. It was a subterranean nightmare of dripping black stone, freezing draughts, and the perpetual suffocating scent of decay. For Lady Rosalind of House Griffith, it had been home for 21 agonizing days. Her wrists were rubbed raw, the silver-laced iron cuffs biting into her flesh, suppressing her wolf and keeping her in a state of perpetual human weakness. The silver burned, a slow, agonizing throb that radiated up her arms and settled deep in her chest. She leaned her head against the frost-covered wall, her breath pluming in the pitch-black air. She was starving, bruised and broken, but the fire in her emerald eyes refused to extinguish. She was no traitor. Rosalind had been the most skilled apothecary and healer the York Pack had seen in a century. She had dedicated her life to the study of herbs, poultices, and the ancient healing arts of their kind. But when Alpha Richard, the beloved and aging leader of their pack, was found dead in his chambers, his lips stained blue and his veins turned black, the blame had been swiftly and ruthlessly pinned on her. She remembered the swift trial, a mockery of justice orchestrated by Lord Harrington, the Alpha's ambitious and venomous cousin. Harrington had produced a vial of concentrated wolfsbane and nightshade, conveniently found beneath the floorboards of Rosalind's apothecary. He had paraded false witnesses, servants who had been bribed or threatened, claiming they saw Rosalind sneaking into the Alpha's kitchens. "She seeks to weaken us from within." Harrington had roared to the assembly, his eyes gleaming with a sick, triumphant light. "A traitor to her Alpha, a poisoner in our midst. Let her rot in the deep cells until the executioner's block is readied." Harrington's motives were transparent to anyone who truly looked. With Alpha Richard dead and his rightful heir, young Arthur, still too young to challenge for leadership, Harrington was perfectly positioned to seize the title of Alpha. Rosalind, who knew of Harrington's secret dealings with rogue mercenaries and his embezzlement of pack resources, was the only one standing in his way. She had to be eliminated, but the execution had been delayed. The drums of war had drowned out the cheers for her death. For the past 3 days, the earth above Rosalind had shuddered. The muffled, rhythmic pounding of battering rams, the distant screams of dying men, and the distinct, terrifying howls of a massive invading force had echoed down into the abyss. The ironclad pack had arrived. Led by the fearsome King Kaelin, the ironclad were a brutal, highly disciplined army from the northern mountains. Kaelin was known as the Winter Wolf, a ruthless conqueror who had been uniting the fractured werewolf territories under one banner, through diplomacy when possible, and through overwhelming bloodshed when necessary. As a heavy silence finally fell over Wormkeep, Rosalind knew the castle had fallen. The York Pack was no more. The heavy iron door at the top of the dungeon stairs groaned open, the sound screeching like a wounded animal. Footsteps heavy, booted, and deliberate began to descend. Rosalind braced herself. The conquerors had come to claim their spoils, and traditionally, prisoners of the old regime were either slaughtered without a second thought or enslaved. She closed her eyes, praying to the moon goddess that death would be swift. "Check every cell," a gruff voice echoed through the damp corridor. "King Kaelin wants an inventory of all surviving prisoners. Harrington claims the late Alpha's murderer is down here. The king wishes to see the poisoner himself." Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs. Harrington had survived. The coward had likely surrendered the castle to save his own skin and was now offering her up as a prize, a token of his loyalty to the new king. She pulled weakly against her chains, a low, defiant growl vibrating in her parched throat. If she was going to die today, she would not cower like a beaten dog. King Kaelin walked through the blood-slicked courtyards of Wormkeep, his expression carved from the very ice of his northern home. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and lethal, his armor scarred from countless battles. His dark hair was swept back, and his piercing silver-gray eyes missed nothing. At 32, he had conquered half the continent, yet a hollow emptiness persisted in his chest, a void his wolf raged against daily. He had no Luna, no mate to share the burden of his crown. "The castle is secured, my king," reported Thomas, his trusted beta and oldest friend. Thomas wiped a streak of blood from his jaw, his breath heavy. "The York soldiers who surrendered have been disarmed. Lord Harrington is waiting in the great hall. He is. Eager to please, Kaelin sneered, his wolf rumbling with disgust. A man who turns on his own pack so quickly will turn on us just as fast. Keep him guarded. He mentioned a prisoner, sire, Thomas continued, matching Kaelin's long strides as they entered the dimly lit keep. The one who allegedly poisoned Alpha Richard. Harrington suggests a public execution to show the pack that you bring justice. Justice, Kaelin mused coldly. Take me to the dungeons. I will judge this poisoner myself before I let a traitorous rat like Harrington dictate my executions. The descent into the dungeons was foul. The stench of mildew, old blood, and human waste was overpowering, making Kaelin's heightened senses flare with irritation. Torches flickered on the walls, casting long, demonic shadows. As they walked deeper into the subterranean prison, a strange sensation washed over Kaelin. His wolf, usually a disciplined, dormant force of violence in the back of his mind, suddenly stood at attention. What is it? Kaelin thought, pausing on the stone steps. Then, it hit him. Cutting through the putrid stench of the dungeon was a scent so pure, so intoxicating, it felt like a physical blow to his chest. It smelled of wild pine, heavy rain, and a sweet underlying note of raw honey. Kaelin gasped, one hand flying to the hilt of his broadsword, his silver eyes flashing a brilliant, luminous gold. Kaelin? Thomas asked, stepping back in alarm as the king's aura suddenly exploded, filling the narrow corridor with a suffocating, dominant pressure. Mate! His wolf roared, clawing at his insides, demanding to be let loose. Mate! Kaelin didn't answer his beta. He couldn't. He broke into a run, his heavy boots thundering against the stone floor. He followed the scent, the invisible tether pulling him deeper into the abyss, past empty cages and the skeletal remains of forgotten prisoners. The scent grew stronger, richer, agonizingly close. He stopped abruptly in front of the last cell at the end of the corridor. The iron door was heavily barred. Open it, Kaelin commanded, his voice dropping an octave into a dual-toned feral growl that sent shivers down Thomas's spine. Sire, this is the cell of the— I said, open the damn door, Thomas! Kaelin roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls like thunder. Thomas hurriedly produced the heavy iron keys confiscated from the dungeon master. With a click, the lock gave way, and Kaelin threw the heavy iron door open, ripping it so hard the hinges groaned and buckled. The light from the torch spilled into the cell, revealing a nightmare. Chained to the far wall was a woman. She was clad in rags, her dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, falling over her face. She was dangerously thin, her porcelain skin marred by dark purple bruises and the sickening burn marks of silver at her wrists. As the light hit her, she slowly raised her head. Emerald green eyes, vivid and burning with an unyielding, fierce defiance, met his gold ones. The world stopped. The snap of the mating bond was instantaneous and violent. It was a physical shockwave that drove Kaelin to his knees, stealing the breath from his lungs. The universe condensed down to this single damp room and the broken woman chained to the wall. He felt her pain, her starvation, her bone-deep exhaustion, and her blazing fury as if it were his own. Stay back, Rosalind croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse, baring her teeth at the massive, terrifying man who had just entered her cell. She didn't understand why his eyes were glowing gold, nor did she understand the sudden magnetic pull in her own chest, a warmth that fought against the cold of the silver chains. Kaelin didn't hear her warning. His wolf had taken absolute control. He moved across the cell with terrifying speed. Rosalind flinched, turning her head away, expecting a blow. Instead, Kaelin dropped his broadsword. His large, calloused hands gently grasped the heavy silver chains binding her left wrist. He didn't care that the silver hissed against his own skin, searing his flesh. With a guttural roar of pure, untamed strength, Kaelin ripped the iron fixture straight out of the solid stone wall. Dust and mortar exploded outward. He turned to the right wrist and did the same, the sound of tearing metal echoing in the small space. Rosalind collapsed forward, her legs too weak to support her, but she didn't hit the filthy ground. Kaelin caught her, pulling her small, fragile body into his massive chest. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her intoxicating scent. He growled softly, a sound of profound possession and desperate relief. Mine, the Alpha King rumbled against her skin, the word vibrating through her very soul. My Luna. In the doorway, Thomas stood frozen, the keys slipping from his hand and clattering against the stone floor. The poisoner, the traitor who had murdered Alpha Richard. She was King Kaelin's fated mate. The Grand Hall of Wormkeep, which only hours ago had been the seat of the York Pack's power, was now a theater of tension. Banners of the ironclad pack, a black wolf on a field of silver, had been hastily draped over the old tapestries. King Kaelin sat upon the high seat, but he was not paying attention to the nobles kneeling before him. His entire focus was on the woman sitting beside him. Rosalind had been cleaned, her wounds treated by the ironclad's own royal physicians. She was dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep forest green, a heavy fur mantle draped over her trembling shoulders. The silver burns on her wrists were wrapped in soothing bandages. She sat stiffly, overwhelmed by the sudden, terrifying shift in her reality. One moment she was waiting for the executioner's axe. The next, she was sitting beside the most feared conqueror in the realm, connected to him by an ancient, unbreakable magic she could barely comprehend. The mating bond hummed beneath her skin, a warm, protective current that drew her toward Kaelin. Every time she shifted, his hand would instinctively tighten on the armrest, his golden eyes tracking her every movement. He was highly territorial, his wolf pacing near the surface, daring anyone in the room to look at her the wrong way. Standing in the center of the hall, flanked by heavily armed guards, was Lord Harrington. The man looked nervous, his eyes darting between the menacing Alpha King and the woman he thought he had successfully buried in the dark. "You bring me a kingdom built on rot, Harrington." Kaelin's voice sliced through the silence of the hall. It was a cold, deadly sound. "My king." Harrington bowed deeply, sweat beading on his forehead. "I surrendered Wormkeep to save my people from unnecessary bloodshed. I offer you my absolute loyalty. But I must protest." The woman sitting beside you, a low, vibrating snarl ripped from Kaelin's chest. The sound was so terrifying that several of the kneeling nobles whimpered and pressed their faces to the stone floor. "Speak of her with respect, or I will remove your tongue from your skull," Kaelin warned, leaning forward. "Apologies, sire," Harrington stammered, swallowing hard. "But she is Rosalind Griffith. She is the traitor who poisoned my cousin Alpha Richard. She is a murderer. It is a matter of pack law and public record. To harbor her, it will cause unrest among the newly conquered. They demand justice." Thomas, standing by the king's side, leaned down and murmured urgently. "He is right, Kaelin. The transition of power is volatile. If the York people believe you are protecting a regicide because of the mate bond, they will revolt. We cannot fight a rebellion from within." Kaelin's jaw clenched. He knew the politics of war. He knew the danger. But looking at Rosalind, feeling the absolute purity of her spirit through their bond, he knew she was innocent. His wolf would not have bonded with a creature of treachery. Rosalind, sensing the political peril her mate was in, found her voice. She placed a gentle, steadying hand on Kaelin's forearm. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through them both, instantly calming the king's raging wolf. "I did not kill Alpha Richard," Rosalind spoke, her voice ringing clear and strong through the grand hall. She looked directly at Harrington, her emerald eyes blazing. "I was his healer. I loved him like a father. You claim you found wolfsbane in my quarters, Harrington, but you failed to mention where it came from." "Lies," Harrington spat. "Desperate lies from a witch." "Is it?" Rosalind challenged, standing up. Kaelin instantly stood beside her, a towering wall of protection. "In my apothecary, there is a ledger, a bound red book where I record every herb purchased and supplied. If it has not been burned, you will find an entry from 4 days before the Alpha's death. Lord Harrington ordered a massive quantity of refined wolfsbane, claiming it was for hunting rogue bears in the eastern woods. But there were no bear tracks reported by the border patrols. Whispers erupted among the York nobles. "Silence," Harrington shouted, his face turning crimson. He looked at Kaelin, feigning outrage. "My king, you cannot listen to the desperate fabrications of a convicted murderer. She is using witchcraft to blind you." "I need no witchcraft to see a coward, Harrington," Kaelin said softly, stepping down from the dais. The room held its breath as the massive king closed the distance between himself and the trembling lord. "Thomas, send a detail to the apothecary. Find the red ledger." Harrington's eyes widened in sheer panic. He knew the ledger existed. He had tried to burn the apothecary, but the invasion had disrupted his plans. The evidence was still there, Cornered and desperate, the facade of the groveling lord vanished. "She is a curse!" Harrington screamed. In a lightning-fast motion, he drew a hidden dagger from his boot. The blade was not steel, but pure, gleaming silver, etched with dark runes. It was an assassin's weapon, designed to bypass a werewolf's healing factor. With a roar, Harrington lunged not at the king, but past him, aiming straight for Rosalind. He knew if he killed the fated Luna, the king would be crippled by the severing of the bond, throwing the room into chaos, enough chaos for him to escape. "No!" Kaelin bellowed. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Rosalind froze as the silver blade arced toward her chest, but before the metal could strike, a massive shadow eclipsed the light. Kaelin threw his body in front of hers. Shah! The sickening sound of metal tearing through flesh echoed in the hall. Kaelin grunted, a harsh, breathless sound, as Harrington's silver dagger sank deep into his side, right beneath his ribs. Rosalind screamed as her mate staggered back, the agonizing burn of the silver transferring through their bond, making her gasp in sympathetic pain. But King Kaelin did not fall. With the silver dagger still lodged in his side, his eyes flared a blinding, demonic gold. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out and clamped his massive hand around Harrington's throat, lifting the treacherous lord entirely off the floor. Harrington gagged, his legs kicking wildly in the air, his hands clawing uselessly at the iron grip crushing his windpipe. "You," Kaelin growled, his voice a monstrous rumble that shook the very foundations of the hall, "are the traitor." With a sickening crack, Kaelin snapped Lord Harrington's neck. He tossed the lifeless body aside like a piece of discarded refuse. The hall descended into absolute, terrified silence. The York nobles stared in shock at the dead lord, the truth of the betrayal crashing down on them. Kaelin swayed slightly, clutching his bleeding side. The silver was acting fast, blackening the veins around the wound. Rosalind didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, catching him before his knees could buckle, her hands moving expertly over the wound. "Thomas, fetch me Yarrow clean water and a binding cloth. Now," she ordered, her voice laced with the commanding authority of a Luna. As she looked up into Kaelin's pale face, he reached out, a bloodied hand gently cupping her cheek. Despite the agony tearing through him, a small, triumphant smile played on his lips. "You see, my lords," Kaelin managed to say, his voice echoing weakly but firmly in the quiet hall. "The traitor is dead, and my queen has just saved my life." The grand hall erupted into controlled chaos. The heavy oak doors were sealed by the ironclad guards as Thomas barked orders, his booming voice cutting through the panic. Kaelin lay on the massive stone table in the center of the room, his breathing shallow and ragged. The silver dagger had been pulled from his side, but the wound was not closing. For an Alpha King, flesh should have already begun knitting itself back together. Instead, the veins branching out from the puncture were turning a sickening necrotic black. Rosalind pressed her hands against the wound, her palms glowing faintly with the innate healing energy of her wolf, but it was being pushed back by a vicious, dark resistance. She leaned down, bringing her face close to the king's torn flesh, and inhaled. Beneath the metallic tang of blood and the burning ozone scent of silver, there was a sweet, cloying aroma. Bitter almonds and crushed hemlock. "This is not just a silver wound," Rosalind said, her voice tight with rising panic. She looked up at Thomas, her emerald eyes fierce. The blade was coated in Manticore's breath. "It's a paralytic venom mixed with concentrated wolfsbane. It's designed to stop an alpha's heart in minutes." Thomas's face drained of color. "Can you save him?" "I need my supplies," she demanded, stripping off her heavy fur mantle to move faster. She looked at the ironclad soldiers who were staring at her with a mix of awe and suspicion. "Do not stand there gawking. If your king dies, this entire region falls to slaughter." She grabbed a terrified York servant by the shoulders. "Run to the apothecary. In the cellar, hidden behind the casks of ale, there is an iron lockbox. Bring it to me. And you," she pointed to Thomas, "I need boiling water, clean linen, and a mortar and pestle." "Why should we trust you?" snarled one of the ironclad lieutenants, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You are a York. You could be finishing the job Harrington started." Rosalind didn't cower. She drew herself up to her full height, allowing the newly awakened bond with Kaelin to surge through her. The oppressive, commanding aura of a Luna flooded the room, making the lieutenant stagger backward, instinctively exposing his neck. "Because he is my mate," Rosalind roared, the sound echoing with the dual-toned timbre of her wolf. "And I will gut anyone who stands between me and his survival. Move!" The men scrambled. Minutes felt like agonizing hours. Kaelin's golden eyes were glazed over, his massive chest shuddering with every labored breath. He reached out blindly, his blood-stained fingers wrapping weakly around Rosalind's wrist. "Do not fear," Kaelin rasped, coughing up a spatter of dark blood. "If I fall, Thomas will protect you." "You are not falling," Rosalind whispered fiercely, tears pricking her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "You tore me from the dark, Kaelin. I will not let you leave me alone in the light." The servant burst back into the hall, clutching the heavy iron lockbox. Rosalind snatched it, her fingers flying over the intricate combination lock. She threw the lid open, revealing rows of rare, perfectly preserved herbs and vials of shimmering liquids. "I trained under Master John Hall," Rosalind muttered, her hands moving with frantic precision. "He was a real physician, a man who documented the anatomical truths of our kind when others relied on superstition. He mapped the circulatory response to Manticore's breath. I know how to beat this." She turned to Thomas and the physicians. "Listen closely. I need you to prepare this exact mixture, or his blood will boil in his veins. 3 measures of dried kingsfoil, to draw the necrotic poison from the muscle tissue. 1 drop of pure moonflower nectar, to stimulate the wolf's regenerative healing factor. A handful of crushed willow bark, to manage the fever that will spike when the antidote enters his heart. Charcoal dust, to bind the lingering venom in his digestive tract." As the physicians furiously ground the ingredients, Rosalind took a small obsidian knife from her box. "Thomas, hold him down. This is going to burn him from the inside out." Thomas gripped the king's shoulders. Rosalind took the steaming poultice, mixed it with the moonflower nectar, and packed it directly into Kaelin's open wound. Kaelin's eyes flew wide open. A roar of pure, unadulterated agony ripped from his throat, shaking the dust from the chandeliers. His back arched off the stone table, his muscles violently convulsing as the antidote warred with the venom in his bloodstream. It took Thomas and 4 heavily armored guards to keep the king from thrashing off the table. Rosalind held her ground, pressing her hands firmly over the poultice, chanting a low, rhythmic healing prayer in the old tongue. Her energy poured into him, a warm golden light that fought back the encroaching black veins. Slowly, agonizingly, the convulsions stopped. Kaelin's breathing evened out. The necrotic black veins faded back to a healthy bruised purple, and the torn flesh finally began to knit itself together, steaming slightly in the cold air of the hall. Rosalind slumped forward against the table, exhausted, gasping for air. "You did it," Thomas whispered, staring at the wound in disbelief. "You saved the winter wolf." But the relief was shattered instantly by the deafening blast of a war horn echoing from the courtyard outside. The heavy oak doors of the great hall rattled violently as something massive slammed into them from the other side. "Treason!" a guard shouted from the high windows. "Mercenaries in the lower courtyard! They wear the crest of the Red Hand." Thomas drew his broadsword, his face twisting in fury. "Captain Gideon, Harrington must have hired the Red Hand mercenaries as a contingency. He promised them the castle's treasury if the Ironclad invaded. They know the king is wounded," Rosalind realized, looking at the barred doors that were beginning to splinter under the relentless assault of battering rams. Harrington's loyalists must have signaled them before he died. "Defend the king!" Thomas roared to the remaining men in the hall. "No one touches the Luna!" The heavy doors groaned as the iron hinges began to buckle. There were only 20 ironclad guards inside the hall with them, against what sounded like hundreds of mercenaries howling for blood and gold outside. "We cannot hold them here," Thomas gritted out, bracing his shoulder against the splintering wood. "Luna, there is a secret passage behind the high throne. Take the king, get him to the mountains." "He cannot be moved," Rosalind said, her mind racing. Kaelin was unconscious, his body locked in a deep regenerative sleep. Moving him now would tear the fragile, newly healed tissues and restart the bleeding. She looked around the grand hall, her eyes calculating. She was no warrior, but Wormkeep had been her home her entire life. She knew its secrets, its flaws, and its hidden arsenals. "Thomas, order your men to fall back to the dais," Rosalind commanded, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her heart. "Form a shield wall around the king." "Luna!" They will overwhelm us in seconds. Do as I say, she ordered. She ran to the massive hearth at the side of the hall, where a roaring fire blazed. Above it, suspended on heavy iron chains, were the ornamental braziers used for festivals. You three, she pointed to the terrified York servants huddled in the corner. Run to the kitchens. Bring every barrel of rendered animal fat and flour you can carry. Now! The doors splintered with a deafening crack. A massive, serrated blade shoved through the gap, followed by the jeers of the red-hand mercenaries. The servants returned moments later, rolling 3 heavy wooden barrels across the stone floor. Break them open in front of the doors, Rosalind instructed. Spread the fat across the floor. Pile the flour on top. The soldiers looked confused, but Thomas, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes, nodded sharply. Do it! As the fat and flour were spread in a wide, slippery arc across the entrance, Rosalind ran back to her apothecary box. She grabbed a handful of sulfur powder and a bundle of dried snapdragon stalks. She rushed to the nearest torches lining the walls and doused them in the sulfur, creating makeshift incendiary flares. Cover your faces with damp cloth, Rosalind yelled to the guards, tearing a strip of linen from her dress and pressing it to Kaylin's face. With a final, catastrophic crunch, the grand oak doors blew completely off their hinges. Over 100 mercenaries flooded into the hall, led by Captain Gideon, a towering brute of a man, with half his face scarred by fire and a massive warhammer gripped in his hands. He laughed, a cruel, grating sound, as he saw the small contingent of guards protecting the unconscious king. The Winter Wolf is asleep, Gideon roared, raising his hammer. Take his head! The bounty is ours! The mercenaries charged forward with a blood-curdling war cry. As soon as the first line of attackers hit the slick, fat-covered floor, their heavy boots lost all traction. Men crashed into one another, slipping and sliding in a chaotic pile of armor and weapons. Now! Rosalind screamed. She hurled the sulfur-coated torches directly into the massive pile of airborne flour that had been kicked up by the scrambling mercenaries. Boom! The flour dust ignited in the air, creating a massive concussive fireball that engulfed the entrance of the hall. The shockwave blew the front line of mercenaries backward out the door, screaming as their armor seared their skin. Thick, choking black smoke rapidly filled the room. Hold the line! Thomas roared, hacking down 2 mercenaries who had managed to stumble through the fire. The hall descended into brutal, close-quarters combat. The ironclad guards fought with the desperate ferocity of wolves, protecting their alpha, utilizing the thick smoke and the slippery floor to their advantage. But they were vastly outnumbered. Gideon, enraged and slightly charred, smashed his way through the melee. He swung his warhammer, catching an ironclad guard in the chest and sending him flying across the room. He locked eyes on the dais. He saw the unconscious king, and standing bravely in front of him, the fragile-looking woman in the green dress. A pretty prize to take back with the king's head, Gideon sneered, stepping onto the dais, his boots heavy and deliberate. Thomas leaped in front of him, their weapons clashing in a shower of sparks. But Thomas was already wounded and exhausted from the siege. Gideon parried a heavy blow, stepped inside Thomas's guard, and drove the butt of his warhammer into the beta's temple. Thomas collapsed, unconscious. Rosalind stood alone. She had no weapons left. She had no magic. She only had the desperate, burning bond in her chest that tied her soul to the man lying behind her. She picked up a discarded sword from a fallen guard, holding it with 2 trembling hands, standing over Kaylin's body. Move aside, little bird, Gideon grunted, raising his heavy hammer. You can't fight me. I don't have to, Rosalind said, her voice dropping to a low, feral whisper. The air in the room suddenly shifted. The ambient temperature plummeted, and a suffocating, terrifying pressure descended upon the hall. The fighting around them ground to a halt as mercenaries and guards alike dropped to their knees, their wolves whining in sheer instinctual terror. Gideon froze, his eyes widening. Behind Rosalind, the stone table cracked under an immense weight. Kaylin rose. He was completely covered in blood, his shirt torn to shreds, exposing the newly scarred flesh on his side, but his eyes were no longer silver. They were a blinding, incandescent gold, glowing like twin suns in the smoky darkness of the hall. His fangs were fully descended, and his claws had ripped through the leather of his boots. The Alpha King had not just awakened. His wolf was entirely in control. driven to madness by the scent of a threat so close to his fated mate. "You dare!" Kaelin's voice was not human. It was a demonic, overlapping vibration that rattled the stained glass windows of the keep. "You dare threaten what is mine!" Gideon swung his warhammer in a panic. Kaelin didn't even draw a weapon. He caught the head of the heavy iron hammer with his bare hand. The metal groaned and buckled under his impossible grip. With a flick of his wrist, Kaelin shattered the wooden handle, disarming the mercenary captain instantly. Gideon backed away, stumbling over the steps of the dais, his bravado entirely evaporated. "Wait, King Kaelin." "I yield." Kaelin moved faster than the eye could track. He closed the distance, lifting the massive mercenary captain by his armored collar with a single hand. Kaelin's eyes locked onto Gideon's terrified face. "There is no mercy in the winter," Kaelin growled. He threw Gideon across the hall with such devastating force that the man shattered the stone pillar near the entrance, crumpling to the ground, lifeless. The remaining mercenaries dropped their weapons, the clatter of steel echoing in the silent hall. They fell to their faces, trembling, pressing their foreheads to the blood-slicked floor in total submission to the apex predator in the room. Kaelin stood breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his claws dripping. The golden glow in his eyes slowly began to recede, replaced by his natural piercing silver. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the carnage, until it landed on Rosalind. She dropped the heavy sword, her hands shaking, adrenaline leaving her system in a rushing tide. She took a step toward him and stumbled. In a heartbeat, Kaelin was there. He caught her in his arms, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling her scent, the only thing grounding him back to his humanity. "You are safe," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I have you. You need to rest," Rosalind whispered, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. "You almost died." "I had an excellent physician," Kaelin replied, a low rumble of amusement in his chest. A week later, the sun broke over the high towers of Worm Keep, casting a warm golden light over the courtyard. The banners of the Black Wolf and the Silver Moon snapped proudly in the morning breeze. The courtyard was packed with thousands of wolves. The ironclad soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with the surviving members of the York Pack. There was no more division. The shared blood spilt defending the keep had forged a new, unbreakable alliance. King Kaelin stood on the high balcony overlooking the masses. He wore the heavy silver crown of the unified territories, his royal robes hiding the fading scar on his side. He raised his hand, and absolute silence fell over the courtyard. "We came to this fortress as conquerors," Kaelin's voice carried over the wind, strong and unwavering. "We sought to cleanse out the rot of betrayal, and in doing so, we nearly lost everything to the shadows. But the light of this pack was not extinguished. It was simply locked away." Kaelin reached out his hand. Rosalind stepped from the shadows of the balcony into the morning light. She was breathtaking. The rags of the dungeon were gone forever. She wore a stunning gown of silver and deep blue velvet, a delicate diamond diadem resting in her dark hair. She stood tall, her emerald eyes shining with a quiet, undeniable power. The crowd gasped. The York members dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in deep reverence to the woman they had falsely condemned, the woman who had saved their conqueror and spared them from annihilation. "She was branded a traitor by a coward," Kaelin continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "But she is the only reason I draw breath today. She is the true heart of Wormkeep. She is my fated mate." Kaelin turned to her, taking her small hands in his massive ones. He didn't care about the thousands of eyes watching them. He saw only her. "Rosalind of House Griffith," Kaelin said softly, for her ears only. "Will you endure the winter wolf? Will you rule by my side, not just as my mate, but as my equal?" Rosalind smiled, a radiant expression that warmed the cold northern king to his very soul. "Only if you promise to stay out of the apothecary when I am brewing, my king," she teased lightly. Kaelin chuckled, a rich, deep sound. He pulled her flush against his chest and kissed her a fierce, passionate, breathtaking promise that sent a wave of electric heat through their bond. The courtyard erupted into deafening cheers. The howling of 1,000 wolves rose into the morning sky, welcoming the new dawn. The dungeon was empty. The traitor was dead, and the Alpha King had found his Luna. If you loved the intense drama, action, and fated romance of Rosalind and Kaelin's journey, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow werewolf romance fans. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic, real-life-inspired fantasy stories. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite twist, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.